What if the most important facets of your health are things that you've never thought to protect? Dr. John Lieurance introduces a novel framework to health, one that's rooted in ancient symbolism and cutting-edge science. In this episode, we explore the idea of doorways in the body. Yes, a different kind of doorways, specifically the nasal passage, the eyes, the ears, the mouth, and other entry points that are often overlooked but deeply connected to your health and your energy. Through some state-of-the-art procedures, as well as tools like methylene blue, terpenes, botanicals, biofilm busters, and novel nutrients, Dr. John Lieurance shares a new way to approach resilience, longevity, and optimal health. Stick around to learn how to patch up these invisible cracks that might just be draining your body of its energy. In this episode, we explore how the symbol of Ganesh represents doorways and how that applies to the human body. We talked about protecting those doorways. We go over why certain bugs and pathogens in the body have what's akin to a force field, protecting them from eradication by the immune system and what you can do about that. Of course, we talk about the hot topic, which is methylene blue. We talk about the entourage effect when formulating products, the downsides of some traditional medications, and the neglected topic of prostate health. Dr. John Lieurance is a functional and naturopathic medicine expert with over 30 years of experience in neurology, regenerative therapy, and advanced healing modalities. He's a go-to expert sharing insights on things like high-dose melatonin, methylene blue, stem cells, sleep medicine, and phototherapy. As a side note, his book, Melatonin Miracle Molecule, is what convinced me to try high-dose melatonin, and indeed, it can be a game changer for sleep. He also just released the third edition of his book, Methylene Blue Magic Bullet, which is one of the more popular books on the subject. Both of these are rooted in science, and Dr. John is also the founder of Advanced Rejuvenation and Functional Cranial Release in Sarasota, Florida. And he's the scientific advisor to a company called Mitozen. He combines cutting-edge science with spiritual practices to promote vitality, mind mastery, and divine connection. You can find the show notes for everything we discuss at outlier.com, OUTLIYR. And if you want to brush up on the previous episode we recorded together, where we talk a lot about methylene blue specifically, that was episode number 110. So mindbodypeak.com/110. Dr. John has some unique formulas, whether it's high-dose melatonin suppositories, it's methylene blue bars called Lumitol Blue that contain terpenes and polyphenols and other botanicals mixed in with methylene blue, or it's Satori, the Satori bars. You can get a version that has methylene blue in it and that has paraxanthine, so it's a powerful nootropic. We also talk about his product Glutastat, which is a nasal spray, and his meditation mist, which I now think he calls vertical spray. Those are available on a different website called mitozen.club. For those of you tuning in to the video version of this, you might see that my eyes look extra blue because I tried his sananga product, which is called Blue Irie. When we recorded it, I hadn't tried it yet, but I tried it just now, and it is an intense experience, but interesting nonetheless. That's right here. And if you want to try any of the Mitozen products, you guys can use my code URBAN, and that'll save you 5% on your order. These were some of the original methylene blue products on the market, and I like them because they are unique formulas and not just plain old methylene blue. So you can go to mitozen.com, mitozen.com for most of the products, but the ones that are especially powerful and are administered through other delivery mechanisms, such as the nasal sprays, are only available on the Private Members Association, and you can access that in the show notes as well, mitozen.club. But just use the code URBAN at either of them, and you can pick up any of these products with an exclusive discount. All right, ladies and gentlemen, sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode with Dr. John Lieurance. Dr. John Lieurance, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, Nick, it's so great to be back.
Yeah, you were here back on episode number 110. So if you guys want to get a refresher on the things that we covered, and we're about to expand and go into a lot more today, that is an option. A link to everything we discussed will be in the show notes for this episode. To start off today, I want to go into your concept of protecting the body's
entrance points. What do you call it exactly?
Doorways.
Doorways, yes. And how does that relate to a particular Indian god?
I know, right? You just pause the podcast and sit there and see if you can figure that out for a little bit. It's a puzzle. But well, Ganesh is considered the father or the lord of doorways, and you'll see people with Ganesh shirts, and it might say remover of obstacles, right? So like a door is an obstacle. So anytime you get to a point where you no longer can go forward, you have two choices: to get the door open or to figure a way around the door. And so in the Hindu, they see Ganesh as the protector of heaven, basically, and the divine. And so they have a chant, and it goes something like, see if I can remember it, Om Gam Ganapataye Namaha. And they just keep repeating that over and over again. And I think about it like Ganapate. This is like Ganapate Namaha, like going to go to the party, right? So the way that they see it is the more bliss they can become, like just basically feel deep states of bliss. This is the signal for Ganesh to say, yes, you're worthy. You can come into the party, right? So they chant and they just try to muster up as much bliss as they can. And so when you start to look at this, it's kind of fun to play around with the combination of spirit, mind, body, spirit, and tying some of these things together. It is not only fun, but it's, it really starts to explain some of the energies, and I think that some of these ancient religious, ways, they have some wisdom, because there's signs and there's messages there for us to learn from if we really look close. And so the doorways that I see for the body are the eyes. You have the nose, you have the mouth, you have the colon. And then I also, with men, I kind of look at the prostate as being something of an area that can hold toxins or infections. And then in women, there's the vagina. So there's a little bit of additional, things with, man versus woman. And when I look at this and I think, okay, what if I call it taking care of your doorways. So the act of taking care of your doorways that's Ganesh. We have the Ganesh protocols, and maybe we can get some written stuff for you that people can download. I got some things from a couple, I talk about it a lot in my books. I think you were reading a little bit.
Yeah, I've read a number of your books.
Yeah, which one was the one with the Ganesh?
Hard to say. I've finished 2 of your books, and I'm reading 2 currently. So it's hard to say where I came across the material for the first time. But I know you're big on those, and I think I've heard you on other podcasts mentioning them too. One of the doorways you didn't mention, I think, is the ears, which I know is a big part of your work. You're
right. The ears are another doorway, and I didn't mention that. And I don't always mention the eyes as well, because they're not really as much of the toxic, because if you think about like a runny nose and like how much air is going through your nose and how close your nasal passage has an area called the cribriform plate, which is such a thin membrane, and it goes right into your brain. And literally, they've been coming out with more recent studies where they look at both the mouth and the nose, and they're tracking it into the central nervous system, and they're finding that these endotoxins, so basically microbes outgas this it's a fatty material. It's not water soluble. These are fat soluble toxins that, and mold is the same way. And heavy metals kind of go into the same general area. But the fat soluble toxins are the ones that get us in trouble more. So water soluble, our body can eliminate pretty quickly. But these endotoxins, they also call them lipopolysaccharides. They get into the system, and they're one of the most inflammatory compounds known to man. And so we have to control that and keep it to a minimum, because a little bit of it is actually good for you. like if we didn't have any microbes at all, like the boy in the bubble type of thing, like that doesn't work, because our body and our immune system need to be challenged a bit. In fact, you look at like everything going on with like the measles and how, they're just absolutely freaking out. But like they found that when kids have the measles, their immune system is so much stronger later in life. Like kids that their mothers protect them to the point where they don't go and get dirty and like, play with pets, and like kids just do crazy stuff. But like that builds the immune system. They found that when there's a more sterile environment, it doesn't build the immune system. But the problem is that these days, when we're not taking care of our doorways, it's typically the opposite. And there is too much of this microbial overgrowth and something called biofilms, which is really important to understand in the mouth and the nose and even in the colon. But this allows these microbes to build like a protective home, like a protective layer, and it's like a thick gelatinous material. And if you think about like your nasal passage, and you think about like if there's a lot of sticky proteins, a lot of these biofilms in the nasal passage, anything that you're breathing in the air is going to stick like flypaper to that, and it's going to be drawn into your bloodstream. And this is where people can be more reactive to allergies, right? Because the same individual that doesn't have as much biofilm or not at all, because they're taking care of that doorway. And we'll talk about ways that I found to really help take care of the doorways here towards the end. But if you have those two different individuals, the one that has less biofilm isn't going to have as much of a chance to, say, pick up an airborne disease, develop allergies, or have an allergic response. And just overall, their brain is going to be more awake, because when you have toxins like this that cause inflammation, it triggers something called the cell danger response, or it's also been called the Warburg effect. And Otto Warburg was a German, and literally he won the Nobel Prize, but Hitler would not let him go accept it. But he discovered basically cancer, like what happens with a cancer. Like, what's the difference between a cancer cell and a regular cell is the way they make energy. And the normal way that we make energy in the cell is through the electron transport chain, which is what the mitochondria does. And it's based on 4 protein complexes that bounce electrons along. And the 4th protein can use light actually as well as electrons. And so this is where we can get energy from the sun and from like red lights and different types of photon. And some methylene blue magic can happen with that as well. But so back to the cell danger response. So when we have this response in our brain or in any local area where the toxins go in, the inflammation triggers this response. This response is such that we shut down our energy that is really very high producing to something that's very low producing. It's literally 10% of what we would produce otherwise. And that's called fermentation, okay? And so this is a very, very primitive way of making energy. And that's what happens with cancer cells. And so really all of the experts that I've seen that have really looked at cancer, they all say the same thing, is that it's a mitochondrial problem. So this in the core is a problem of how these cells have started to make energy. And so if you stress a cell enough or for long enough, that's what you're going to get, is you're going to get that cell just eventually turns into a cancer cell. And so this is a situation where, individuals have the power to control certain aspects of their health and wellness by looking at their mitochondria and ways to take care of their mitochondria. So when people wind up getting cancer, and there's a lot of people these days, I mean, young, old, middle-aged, I mean, it's like, a lot of it, in my opinion, is coming from, the spike proteins, could be from getting COVID, or it could be from the vaccines. They're just coming out with more and more research about how it's devastating to the immune system and our clotting factors and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of these people, and it's developing into cancer. And inevitably, we're just seeing a lot more these days. So it's hard, although I don't have evidence to say this for sure, but it just seems like cancer has just gone up. So putting things together, that's the biggest shift that we've really seen. We're talking about kind of taking care of our doras and talking about the nasal passage. One of the things that works the best for this biofilm, because if you can't get through that biofilm and you can't get rid of it, then whatever you try to spray up your nose or irrigate your nasal passage with is really not going to wash it through. And so to dissolve that, I found that there's some certain terpenes, like one of them is called linalool, and it's really fascinating. You can look this up, and you can take a dive into like biofilm and holistic approaches to biofilm. And so like essential oils, so lavender is what you have linalool in, right? And so what I've done is I've looked at a lot of the different terpenes and then some of the essential oils, because these, like oregano, sage, clove, bay leaf, these are some oils that can really get in there and have an antimicrobial effect, but also like clear out biofilm. And that's where we designed the glutastat. So, and I should probably be transparent here. So Mitozen, we produce some products that we're probably going to talk about in this podcast. And I'm obviously biased because, I love them. And I think you've used some of them as well, and you love them. And so just keep that in mind that, that's the case.
It's really cool. I've looked into a lot of your products, and I love that you guys incorporate terpenes and other plant extracts in them, because there's the wisdom of the botanicals of the natural world that often complement and synergize really nicely with some of the fancy new molecules newer molecules, I should say, like methylene blue and different things like that. So it's cool to see that you took a multimodal approach to formulating. And that's including the products you mentioned, glutastat, but then also the other newer things you've come out with, like the Satoshi, I want to say it is Satori or Satoshi. Satori, Satori. Like that's a cool one. It has paraxanthine in it, which I've talked about with Sean Wells and Daniel of Update. And it's not just that, you've also added ginkgo and some Ayurvedic herbs. And why is it that you keep going back to the botanicals? What's their value to you?
That's a great question. There's a term they call the entourage effect, and you hear that a lot with terpenes and cannabis. Although, that term can be applied to anything where you have a synergy, where 1 + 1 = 4, right? And so, like I really love copaiba. We use a copaiba in a lot of our formulations, and copaiba actually aids in the absorption and utilization of certain nutrients in the body. But I like to use natural. The only non-natural thing that we use that then could lead us into a nice argument about this, or not argument, but a conversation. Is methylene blue, which is a synthetic molecule. But everything else, I'm really a big fan of all natural, holistic, and then synergistic nutrients, because I find I've been practicing for 30 years, and I've been practicing as a naturopath and a chiropractic neurologist, and so I've had an experience where I've been able to, and a lot of brain-based conditions. Obviously, I'm like the nervous system is a big deal, but like understanding how these nutrients can work together has really been an advantage. To be able to formulate these as well, to see what works and what doesn't work.
When you work with patients, I'm assuming that's what you call them, are you going through a protocol for like a universal protocol? Like, for example, first starting off by addressing biofilms, and then after getting biofilms, addressing the affection that tends to accompany them, and then working on like removing heavy metals, and then going on to the additions, the optimizations, like first subtracting the things that shouldn't be there and then adding on?
Yes, another really good question. That's this idea that you want to stage things. If, like, let's say somebody maybe has some health issues, or they haven't really paid much of attention to their health, and they're relatively healthy, but they maybe want to get and start a protocol or a program to improve their health a little bit more than it is, you want to look at like staging things, because in the beginning, I think taking care of the doorways is really like, that's a primary for me. And that might last for a month to 6 weeks. And we do coaching. We have a number of patients or clients, I think, where they're coaching, they're clients and they're not patients. And so they're part of we have a membership with that. And so we can work with people all over the world, and we do. And so part of that is this now tiered approach to health. And so the beginning is exactly that. Like, we'll test them to see what kind of microbes they might have, whether you have access to testing or not. Most people do. We look at things like viral panels like EBV or Epstein-Barr virus. We look at HHV6. Cytomegalovirus is another one that kind of becomes problematic. You can look at Candida. You can test for this either in the blood, or you can do mycotests, and there's different gut panels that you can do to see what kind of parasites you might have in your digestive system or just in your body in general. We have some different systems of testing that we use for that. But it's like kind of getting an idea of, and you don't even have to really do testing. I think, for people wanting to do it on a budget, you can take some different types of antimicrobials that might be really broad spectrum and just do a parasite cleanse, because it's likely you have some parasites, especially if you're listening to this and you're starting to think, hey, should I do this? Well, yeah, you probably should if you're questioning that, because there's probably some intuition within your body that tells you that would be a good idea. But, even once a year, doing some sort of a cleanse. And so what that would look like would be, at least for 30 days, you're going to spray this antimicrobial. So glutastat is what we use, and that has oregano, sage, clove, bay leaf. It has NAC, it has glutathione, it has silver, and germanium or germinal, and eucalyptol, and linalool. Okay, and I might be missing one or two things because there's a lot in that product, but that's the basics of it. And it really burns. Like when you spray it, I always say it feels like you're getting slapped by your mom, because it's with love and it's going to do you some good, right? But we have it in 3 versions. I would suggest, if you do wind up doing the sinus cleanse, we ought to send you the sheet. We have like a sinus protocol, and you could use it with the glutastat, or you could make something up on your own as well. Just be careful, because if you do something that isn't really kosher up in the nose, you'll suffer. Like I tried to do, I don't know if you saw this video on my Instagram, but I do some crazy videos sometimes. But I was in the ocean, and I irrigated my nasal passage with methylene blue. And it was really messy, and what I didn't talk about in that video was how achy it was afterwards for like 20 or 30 minutes, but yeah, so and then looking at the mouth, and with the mouth, we have an essential oil blend we call Boca Zen, which is like, thyme and cinnamon and oregano and clove, and it's got a variety of terpenes in there as well. And fennel. Like it's just got, I was playing around with these essential oil blends for like years, and then like all of a sudden, like I did this one mixture, and it was like, wow. I mean, it's just people absolutely love it, because it's got the cinnamon and the fennel and the oregano and the clove. It like just has a really unique, but it's also, you're getting slapped by your mom. Like it's really powerful. And the way that I suggest we do this with the mouth is, like, first of all, tongue scraping is important, because that's a biofilm, right? And then flossing. And so you can brush your teeth, right? And then you take the glutastat, after you brush your teeth, you take the glutastat oil and you put it and you move it all around your gums, and then you floss afterwards. And then that flossing will push those essential oils in between your teeth. and it'll really do a great deal for your gums. And then I'll have the Glutastat and the Bocazen in my car, because sometimes on my way to work, or sometimes like on my way home from work or whatever, I'll just grab it and I'll do it. And I just feel good. You know, it feels good to just know you're keeping things clean. And I notice a big difference personally when I get away from this, and I just start to feel like, you know, I'm a little bit more sluggish. And so those are the two strategies that we have for, of course, we have like a methylene blue, gold, and silver eye drop. So if anybody has any problems with their eyes, I definitely think that's a no-brainer, because that just is just an incredible combination of substances for the eyes. And then I like to do like sun gazing, where you're actually getting some photobiomodulation through those substances. Like, the eyes are the part of the body that absorb the most amount of photons, you know, because that's what they use through their sensory, is photons.
I know in shamanic medicine and some of the other alternative ancestral medicines, they drew a clear link between the visual function of the eyes, the physical visual function of the eyes, and life clarity and purpose. And as you mentioned, methylene blue in eye drops, I was thinking methylene blue has very strong protective effects of the mitochondria rich organs of the body, such as the eyes, the heart, the brain, genitals. I can see a very strong use case for using those eye drops to help protect the eyes, not only for against like damage, but then also for life clarity. Did you investigate anything like that?
Yeah, I think that's really an interesting concept with the eyes. And I know like in yoga, they have a lot of like eye yoga type of things that they do to move your eyes all into different positions that you don't, you know, stretching your eyes. And what I've discovered as a practitioner is that the eyes do so much to, because almost every part of your brain has some influence and is used for whether it's visual acuity or the function of the eyes. And so if you think about the eyes have this kind of built-in mechanism they call the vestibular ocular reflex. And so this is like, because the inner ears are talking to the eyes, which are also talking to all of the spinal muscles, you know, more or less all the muscles in your body, but primarily these central core muscles. And they're regulated through this vestibular system, because this is where they're getting their signaling to either compensate or strengthen or tighten or relax as we're moving in different positions and so forth. Like if we're playing sports, you know, you think about that individual is going to be having to maybe look for a ball, and they're going to have to, you know, like a football player running and looking behind them and just catching a football. Like you think about the precision behind how many systems really need to be working. And so if we didn't have this vestibular ocular reflex, or they call it the VOR, then we wouldn't, the world would look like one of those cameras that are moving all over the place. You know, like, you know how sometimes you'll watch movies and they're really jerking all around. And I don't know about you, but that's kind of, I can only watch those for so long before I just start to get, you know, messed up, because they're not using the gimbal on it, right? So this is like a natural gimbal within our eyes, so that the world stays somewhat still, but also when we turn our head and we turn our body, certain muscles aren't going to tear and rip, and that's going to trigger relaxation of muscles in certain ranges of motion, particularly around our core muscles. So we look at those things, and they're also hardwired to your autonomic nervous system, all of the eye functions, right? So when like an individual might be on a boat or something like that, and they're moving around and they get like an autonomic effect, you know, it's because this vestibular ocular reflex is just constantly going and going and going, and so it's doing things that it's not used to doing. And they're midline, right? The eyes are considered midline motor, and so you have the mouth, the tongue, the digestive system, the a lot of the different muscles along the spine. These are all midline motor nerves. And so anything that you do to take care of your eyes is going to translate into taking care of like all of these other things that we talked about.
Your protocol for using your methylene blue based eye drops, is that applying like one drop and then going out into the sun and sun gazing like 20 minutes later, 30 minutes later? Like, I'm guessing it's a very weak dilution because you wouldn't want to have 20 milligrams of methylene blue going into your eyes.
Yeah. It's funny. I told this story just earlier, and you're kind of bringing up, so higher concentration of methylene blue in the eyes. Like I made up my own batch, and I wanted to make it a little bit stronger. And I had someone visiting me. I don't know if you're familiar with Dan Pompa. Dan Pompa, he's a good buddy of mine, and he and I trained with a lot of the same people, and he has a big coaching program as well, and very, very talented healer and individual. And so basically he came to town, and we're out on my boat, and I take out the Blue Eyes. That's the name of this product, and I'm like, hey, try this, because he hadn't tried it. He drops in his eyes, and it did look like it was a little more blue, right? And I thought he was just being a wimp, because he's like, oh man, it's really aching, it's bothering me. And there's a bunch of people on the boat, and they're looking at me like, what'd you do here? And and so I said, let me try it. And I put it in, and lo and behold, it was like, yes, it was achy. But what was wild was within 20 minutes, the aching was gone. And my vision was absolutely like, and when you're out on a boat, you're able to look way down, at houses on the water, like half a mile away or whatever. And I could just see things so clear. And it got me to believe that I think there's a market for something like that, even though it aches. But like, if you could really increase your vision with, certain types of, maybe in the military, even like, certain types of sports where you're shooting skeet or something like that, some individuals might really benefit from that hyper improved vision, and sacrifice being a little bit achy, but just the dilution that we normally provide it in is there's not really a burn. There's just a slight bit of peppermint, so it's like kind of cool and refreshing. But I like to do, just to answer your question, is I like to be at the beach, sun going up, and I take my Blue Eyes out and I drop them in my eyes. And I don't blink. I let it like really pool in my eyes. And then I just like let the sun, and I let those photons go through that substance. And the photons will pick up energy. If you run like a laser, or you run light through a crystal, what comes out on the other end is a coherence through that crystal that is unique and can be really healing. And we use these, like I have this. This is called the photon. You see the sacred geometry in there? Kind of like what they found underneath the pyramids. I don't know if you've been checking that out, but when we shine light through this, these crystals, we're able to activate. We use these often to like activate some of the stem cells that we're using, or some blood and platelets, because we do a lot of orthopedic stuff here, right? And so we have a lot of people coming to us for shoulders and hips and spine, and this just like full integration of taking care of the body, both physically and then at a cellular level.
So the Blue Eyes, to me, it seems like it's a modern take on the ancient practice of like using sananga, which is like the herb infused, like I don't even know what exactly is inside of it, eye drops, and they apply those for ceremony, and it literally increases vision and clarity and all that stuff. So this is like a modern take on that can more, I guess, perhaps harmonize more effectively, more strongly with like the modern lifestyle.
Well, we have two different eye drops available. One of them is called IRE, I-R-E, and this is my kind of version of sananga. So it's sananga, methylene blue, ormus. We have gold in there. So we really like put some the entourage effect, if you will, and it burns. You have a pretty good burn with this drop, and the burning is activating the trigeminal nucleus, which is it's balancing the autonomic nervous system. And we all could use that. I mean, even like in ancient days, I can imagine, that the stress is associated with trying to survive, to calm down some of those stress responses is something that we lose as we get older, as our brain function declines, our nervous system starts to decline. It's something that you see in virtually all diseases, people that have autoimmune diseases, people that have hormonal disruptions and so forth, people that have degenerative neurologic disorders, people that have cancer. I mean, if you look at just all of these diseases, there's almost always a problem with the autonomics with people. And that's something that is really important to stabilize before you start getting into doing anything too crazy. Because if you can't manage, your circulation, your digestion, all these things, you're going to be too susceptible to not being able to tolerate a lot of other types of therapies. So some of these things with like burning of the eyes can be a way to help to stabilize and strengthen the autonomics, because you're kind of activating those pathways, right? So the face, the eyes, the nasal passage, the mouth, putting cold water. Like I've seen people take ice and put it in their, like into like a dish or possibly even like their sink, and this kind of like soak their face. And this is the same thing. Like it's through this dive reflex, and this triggers the autonomic nervous system to actually be more strong and more balanced. And this translates into the body being in more of a parasympathetic state, which is, they call that resting and digesting.
First of all, do you see long-term vision enhancement from this? Of course, it has the acute effects that you mentioned, Dr. Pompa also noticed firsthand. Are you seeing anything longer term with like either repeated practice or the synergy, the entourage of using sun gazing with perhaps the eye drops, then also using the cold water, like facial submersion to activate the mammalian dive reflex, and perhaps other additions to that protocol? Yeah.
Well, there's a nasal spray that it's probably one of our biggest sellers in MitoZen. It's called Zen Meditation Mist. And, so that's going to really burn the nasal, like temporarily though. Actually, people love it. Yeah, it's kind of like wasabi. Yeah, I got to take it out to dinner and I share it with people. And the next thing you know, it's like we're having a Zen party. It's really fun. But, the irie, which is different from the blue eyes, applying that to the eyes, there's a temporary burn. There is like nasal potential with the Zen. With the mouth, the Boca Zen, like I said, it's like the oregano. It's gonna kind of give you a bit of a kick. And then there, like you had mentioned, the dive reflex as well. And these are all really, really important. And it's like just doing it like once or twice is not really going to be, I think, what is going to, more or less, these are things that you can adopt into like certain types of routines, like daily routines. And if you find yourself getting wound up, you're getting stressed, you can feel it, then these types of strategies, I'm a really big fan of breath work as well. Because that breath going through the nose, right? Either that or when you're depleting CO2 is another really, I've been really interested in CO2, and we've been doing some really cool things with breathing CO2 gas and incorporating these CO2 gases into other gas therapies like intermittent hypoxic training. Really, really, really cool stuff, which also supports and stabilizes the autonomics. But yeah, I do see people just getting really, getting a lot better. And a lot of the customers or some of my patients, they'll talk about how they really love this product or that product, and they use it regularly, and it kind of keeps and stabilizes them and keeps them calm.
That's cool. I had no idea that you're doing that, because I have been very fascinated by CO2 therapy for a little while now. Haven't recorded a podcast on it, but it seems like a very opportune area for disruption and more technologies and modalities to be available to consumers.
Yeah. Well, like one thing is what really interesting is, I am starting to believe that it's not nitric oxide that's the primary thing that we want to concentrate on to keep our blood vessels, healthy. Because nitric oxide is like, such a big topic, and there's people that are pounding their chest saying, nitric oxide. But then, if we take a step back, there's some dangers to nitric oxide, right? And so CO2 vasodilates. I mean, CO2 is probably the primary mechanism that is keeping blood vessels healthy, not nitric oxide, although CO2 does have an effect on endothelial nitric oxide, because there's 3 forms of nitric oxide. And, it's not a black or white conversation. It can get quite complex, but 2 of the nitric oxides are really good to get elevated chronically, and that's in endothelial, which CO2 can work on, and neuronal, right? But then there's another one that's called inducible. And inducible nitric oxide is something that really is more meant to be temporary when you get an infection or toxicity. And so if you think about this kind of inflammatory effect, which is this vasodilation, where the body's trying to bring in the groceries and take out the garbage, that's that holy circulation that's so important. And if we don't have that, then, that's where we get into a lot of health and disease issues.
Yeah. I first came across that concept with Mark Sloan. He's one of the other, you're probably not gonna like this term, methylene blue influencers. And he also wrote a book on it a long time ago. And he was talking about how nitric oxide should be really viewed as like the body's backup to carbon dioxide to get some of the vasodilation and increased blood flow and everything. And I became fascinated when I looked into some of the research, and I saw that, as you mentioned, it wasn't as clear cut, and exposure to certain heavy metals, xenoestrogens, infections, these were also increasing one of the forms of nitric oxide. So clearly it's not all a good thing to just indiscriminately boost levels of all forms of nitric oxide.
Yeah, right. And like one of the critiques that methylene blue has had from individuals that weren't really understanding that there was more of a complexity with nitric oxide would say, hey, don't consume methylene blue because it will have this deleterious effect on your nitric oxide levels, and that nitric oxide is the holy grail, and this is going to cause you to have more, problems with circulation and such. And when you really look at it, though, it doesn't touch endothelial and it doesn't touch neuronal. It only works on inducible, which is the stuff that you really want to clean up anyway, right? And that's why, if anybody's really interested in deep diving into some of this nitric oxide stuff, I co-wrote an article with Jason Saunders and Brian Richards. Brian Richards has Sauna Space, so he's kind of like a good source for information on photobiomodulation. And Jason Saunders has basically got his PhD in hyperbaric oxygen. It's pretty crazy. He's also a functional chiropractic neurologist like myself. But and so we geek out big time. And my 3rd edition to the Methylene Blue Magic Bullet book is going to be coming out literally within a week. We just finished it a couple days ago and just waiting on the formatter. But yeah, this article, and so we deep dive into all the different nitric oxides and make it make sense for people. But yeah, it's really great in that way that it cleans up. And that's why it works so well in depression, because they found that depression is kind of hardwired to the inducible nitric oxide, which gets me to think that a lot of people that are depressed probably have chronic infections. It could be like candida or like different types of microbes that just are normal flora for a lot of people, and they don't have a strong immune system. And that's why, they did some large clinical trials on depression with methylene blue. And it was higher doses of methylene blue. It was up towards like 500 milligrams a day, and there's so many people that are thinking, oh, I take 20 milligrams or, it gets dangerous when you get over like 4 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, which that's where you kind of start to get up into that higher level. But it's interesting. It was a large, I think it was like over 1,000 people. And there was a human trial as well. It wasn't an animal study. And, there was no, reported negative effects out of all those people for that high of a dose. It's pretty cool.
I wasn't planning on talking to you about methylene blue because we covered some of the basics of it, but that was almost a year and a half ago. So there's been some new additions to the conversation since then. I've come across that argument all the time. People take all kinds of dosages ranging from half of 1 milligram all the way up to hundreds of milligrams. So there is concern, which I've seen you talk about the potential interactions with other substances such as SSRIs, anything that's an MAOI. And I also saw, when I did some digging into it, that certain health agencies and governing bodies have said it's really only an issue with very high dosage, and if you're using it intravenously, which most consumers are not. What's your current stance on the safety of methylene blue?
Well, again, it's like all the challenges are like in the higher dose, like you mentioned, and there's not really. That's why they call it the magic bullet, because it doesn't have negative effects to the body. But even water, if you take too much water, it would kill you, right? So everything's going to have some sort of a situation where too much is too much. And when you start to get into SSRIs, a lot of people look at that as a black or white, they just wouldn't be open to. And unfortunately, practitioners, they may not really fully understand the molecule and do a deep enough dive into it. And at first blush, if you pull it up on Google or Wikipedia or something, like some of the explanations are really scary, that it's just, hey, you take this with an SSRI and it's going to kill you. Well, you need to have larger doses, and they found that the challenges they had with the SSRIs were based on 5 people that had a thymectomy, and that was intravenous and a high dose of, I think it was around 500 milligrams done intravenously, and the thymus gland has a very high metabolic rate, and so it pulls a lot of the methylene blue in because there's a lot of mitochondria in there, and so you can distinguish the thymus from the rest of the other tissue so that you can get all of it, right? Because that's what they want to do when they have a cancer in the thymus. And so the people that were on SSRIs had some problems. I think a couple of them died. And so then the warning was just a blanket warning that, no SSRIs and methylene blue. But then the Mayo Clinic retracted that. The entire country of Canada retracted that. But our U.S. FDA has not retracted that warning. And unfortunately, I think a lot of depression people are deprived of a substance that would treat the depression and treat it in a way that's really treating the root cause, which is the methylene blue is improving the cellular energy. It's got some antimicrobial effects, and it's going to calm down this nitric oxide, which is what's actually causing the depression. We've all, anybody that wants to watch TV, you're going to have half the commercials or commercials on. If this antidepressant's not working, ask your doctor to add, this to it or that to it, right? Because they don't. And when you chronically elevate serotonin, you start to run into a lot of problems. And this is important for, I think, a lot of people, because you could be talking about 5-HTP or St. John's wort. There's other substances that elevate serotonin. And yeah, you might feel a little happier. But the problem is at night, you're within your circadian rhythm, you have an area in your brain that's called the blue spot. And in Latin, that means blue spot. It's locus coeruleus. And so the locus coeruleus has a sensor on it that it stores memory. So everything that happened during the day, it's like a thumb drive. You have memories that are stored here. And then when you go to sleep, particularly in REM sleep, that memory is up-regulated up into your higher brain centers. And that's what you call integration, right? So you're matching, okay, what happened today and how does that relate to things that have happened in the past? And then taking that information moving forward, like what what I might want to plan. And so it would change your behavior a bit to be more, I think, mature and grow. And so when we look at the inability to have memory consolidation, it's a lot of like alcohol really messes this up, right? Like, maybe we have relatives and we have some relatives that just kept drinking, all through high school and beyond. And then, they were drinking for so long, and then you're looking at them saying, man, the person really hasn't matured much. And that's because they're not having memory consolidation. I mean, among a lot of other things, but alcohol, different drugs, serotonin, estrogen. So women in their lower estrogen, like higher estrogen's better for this memory consolidation, but lower estrogen cycles, they interfere with REM sleep. And so when you don't get quality REM sleep, this integration doesn't happen. We all want to integrate our life, right? I mean, it's a big deal. Like if you want to be good in business, or you want to play chess, or you want to surf or learn a new sport or anything, you want to be able to consolidate the short-term memory. And so SSRIs raise serotonin, and serotonin inhibits this memory consolidation. It doesn't allow it. And it kind of goofs up your... And so most people that are taking SSRIs, think about it, they're taking it because they're depressed, right? And we got a lot of kids on it, and we're going to inhibit their memory consolidation. It's just it's just not the right pathway. Versus what if we were to give them methylene blue? I think we'd have we would be enhancing their memory consolidation. There's actually a study where they were doing phobia, and they're treating phobia, and they were exposing them to things that they would be afraid of. And the study was the control group didn't take methylene blue, but they had the methylene blue group actually take 1 dose of methylene blue. And then they looked at what were the results, and it was much better with people because they concluded that it must have been enhancing memory consolidation, because it's really a mitochondrial thing. The cells within certain parts of your brain can have up to millions of mitochondria, right? But the average cell throughout your body might just have a few hundred. But think about that, a cell that has 2 or more million mitochondria, man, that cell is super, super metabolically powerful, but it's also really vulnerable if you start getting challenged. Like we talked about the doorways, and the inflammation being the real key to shutting down mitochondrial power and shifting it into this more primitive state. And so those cells in the locus coeruleus are among, the most sensitive, and that's why. And so anything that you do to enhance your vitality through enhancing your mitochondria, that's what I'm into. We call it metabolic medicine, right?
Yeah.
It's just stepping back, and it's common sense things, keeping inflammation low, taking things that can enhance your circulation, and that can, different things that can help to hack your nervous system, like we've talked about already.
The tragedy with SSRIs too is that one of the black box warnings on them is suicidal thoughts. And if this is going to help you be happier, you wouldn't expect to see the opposite of the intended effect as one of the potential side effects. And I love the idea of targeting some of the root causes. And it seems from your work and also from my own studying that really improving cellular energy can help address pretty much everything going on in the body. And then also, if you already have it optimized and you get it a little more optimized, then you can eke out some extra percentage points of performance.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if that's what you're into, and I think these days, what happened with COVID, I don't know about your thoughts, but there was this big stressor, right? That stimulated a lot of people to start really looking at health. And it had this almost opposite effect to what, I don't know. I mean, sometimes you look at all the conspiracy theories and they're all turning out to be true, right? And so we're learning more and more about how corrupt everything was, and how we were, you and I and a lot of other people were having to be really quiet about our real opinion. It was so much censorship, but it turned into something that I think just activated some interest in health and wellness. And so a lot of people are really interested. I mean, that's why your podcast is doing so good, because people want to just soak it up. And you're doing a great job. Absolutely fantastic.
There's some other topics I want to cover around methylene blue. There's some other things I keep seeing come up online that I think, since you study this and this is your wheelhouse, makes sense to cover briefly. And that is the issue of potential staining of internal organs by methylene blue. People express concern. I don't know if that would have any functional outcome difference, like if it would matter if your internal organs were stained blue because you're consuming large amounts of methylene blue often. What's your take there?
Well, so the methylene blue is going to get into the mitochondria, right? So it's just like when they did the thymectomy. When they opened these individuals up, they saw the thymus gland was like dark blue, right? It was stained, right? But this clears out of your system. It's not a permanent thing, but it's really showing. I've used it. I noticed there was an article, and I'm not going to drop names or anything, but there was a recent article that it starts with that. It has pictures of a blue brain and a blue heart, and it painted it to be like, okay, so this crosses the blood-brain barrier, it stains, and therefore it's toxic. Like to basically have that line of rationale, it just doesn't make sense. And in fact, there's no toxicity, well, unless you get into really high doses, right? So basically with what we're talking about, there's a lot of safety within it. It's been around for over 100 years. They've been so much studies on methylene blue, and so it's temporarily staining because it's getting into the mitochondria, which is what we want. And I would almost offer, looking at those images, is like, how cool is this? We know it's getting into the brain. And then when you think about how blue is going to absorb red, which is its opposite, and it's going to reflect blue, right? So you see blue, but it's actually a sponge for red. And that's why, the spectrum, the vast majority of the sun is in the red and infrared. And so these are the therapies that are really helpful to do along with methylene blue, because it does kind of catch those photons and draws them into that fourth complex that we talked about earlier, the cytochrome C. Like, it's going to pull those photons in. It's going to lubricate us to make more. It's a substance called ATP, which is at the very end of that. What's the Krebs cycle, or the electron transport chain. It's everything. This is how we make energy. That is life force. And so the more we can pay attention to enhancing that, and so toxicity and infections, in my opinion, are at the root of almost all diseases, because they're triggering inflammation, which is triggering the cell danger response, or that Warburg effect, which then shuts down life force. And then we have certain genes, and our genes are expressed in unique ways, right? And so we may not detox this as good, and we might be better at detoxing this, and our body doesn't balance in this certain way. And so when you have the low energy, then the genes get turned on that you don't want turned on, and express themselves with a disease pattern that's unique to that individual, okay? And so this is really at the core of how it works. So we can be very general in our approach with reducing inflammation in the body, taking care of your doorways. We didn't really get into the colon, but the microbiome is just so important, right? I'm a big fan of making your own yogurt, and eating fermented foods. And there's things within the diet that are really important, like, a lot of alcohol might be negative to the microbiome, and different types of medicines and so forth. But yeah, you get those things. And then the prostate, we didn't get in. So the third edition to the book, we have a whole chapter on prostate, because I really wanted to get out to the world this treatment that we're doing in the clinic called Prosta Blue Zone. And it's something that I felt was a really important thing to pioneer because prostate cancer is the second leading cause of death, second leading cause of cancer in men over the age of 40. And it's a big deal, right? And it's very treatable with a lot of things in the sense that they can remove the prostate. And if it's caught early enough, most people survive, although a lot of people might have incontinence and not be able to get an erection and you know, all the things surrounding having this surgery. But what I found is that there's an infection in virtually all men that we've tested over the age of 40. And certainly if you're having frequent urination or it's difficult to initiate the flow, or you're feeling some, you know, achiness or sensation around, you know, kind of the area of the prostate, then you might want to do a semen test. And so you can reach out to us and we can send you a kit. And so you collect the semen and it goes into this special lab that does something called next generation sequencing. And this next generation sequencing, they literally have the DNA pattern of up to 60,000 microbes, and they cross-reference it with what antibiotic it's sensitive to. So the report we get back, generally it's anywhere from 2 or 3 to sometimes 5 or 6 microbes. And then they tell you which antibiotic. And so then we may add 1 or 2 different antibiotics. We take methylene blue. We take the patient's blood and spin it down because the immune system is in that buffy coat, if you will. There's white blood cells, there's platelets. And that I had learned about a study where they had horses that were refractory to antibiotics and they had infections in their knees. And so instead of putting these horses down, this researcher took their blood and just injected platelet-rich plasma into their knees, and it cleared it up. It's like it just goes in there and it just like mops up all the different microbes. And so I thought that would be a good idea to add into this kind of entourage treatment. And then we inject ozone. And so this injection is done with, you know, medical staff, ultrasound guidance, and it's a series of 3. So individuals first do the semen test. We look to see what microbes they have. And I mean, we've had people where like they couldn't ejaculate, right? So they're like, we had one person that had most of their prostate removed from a surgery. There was still some left and they just couldn't ejaculate. And then they started ejaculating right after, you know, within a few days of receiving the treatment. People with urinary incontinence, you know, you'll see a lot of improvement there. But this is a pocket in the male body that can harbor chronic infection and release these endotoxins, which can then, you know, cause a lot of problems throughout the entire body. Just like in the mouth, you also have cavitations that can happen with the bone and where your wisdom teeth are removed, or root canals, right? So it's not just in the mouth of the gums, but you're talking about like actually in the bony structure. And so these are all things that you get these things dialed in, and a lot of doctors treating cancer, I mean, that's what they do. The coffee enemas, right? And cone beam, and then, you know, removing the cavitations, getting them, you know, away from a lot of refined foods to their microbiome. It's a very microbiome focused diet. You know, this is at the core, you know, and I would almost say just most people would do really well with a good, well-rounded kind of protocol, just thinking in these terms.
Yeah. Would you see some of these stealth infections on routine blood work, like say HS-CRP or some kind of other biomarker like that, if you couldn't explain an otherwise, say, high value?
Are you talking about with the lab tests for the at the prostate with the semen test, or just the general that we talked about in the beginning, like the EBP?
Both.
And
so if people had infections in either place, would they? I mean, obviously the targeted test is going to be a lot more effective, but if they saw a high number otherwise, could they also figure out that, okay, perhaps I have a stealth infection, that's why my inflammation's out of the range or what it should be for someone who's otherwise healthy, and therefore I should follow up and do additional testing?
Yeah. I think that's a reasonable line of thinking. They don't always show up in lab work is the problem, you know, and the standard labs that doctors are using, that I used for a good amount of my practice in the earlier days, you know, it just doesn't show up. And then you start to, like with like C-reactive protein, right? If you do high sensitivity C-reactive protein, you're going to actually be seeing something that's a little bit more reflective, where just regular CRP, which is a marker for inflammation, in a lot of the cases I see is normal, where they also call it cardiac CRP, but it's a more sensitive marker. But it's hard to really navigate the standard lab work with people. You have to do like special labs that and like the testing of the EBV and HHV6 and the cytomegalovirus and some of the other viral infections are not normally tested. And most doctors, when I've done them, the patient has gone to their primary and they come back. Most times these doctors will say, oh, that's nonsense because it's, it could be that you had it in the past, right? But when you look at these people's history, which is what they don't really consider, is like, okay, have you been sick in the last year? And, a lot of these people have just been sick for a long time, and so the history needs to match that, where they got really ill and then that they don't feel good, right? But a lot of these people maybe don't have that history. And so you can't necessarily just assume that these titers are high just because they had the infection when they were a kid. It doesn't last that long, right? So they're not done by a lot of doctors because they don't understand them that way.
From your experience, I recognize that since people are coming to you, there's going to be a bias, like a sample bias, that they're coming to you to work with. And so they probably suspect they already have some kind of infection, whether acute or chronic. Are you seeing that in general across your population that people have something, whether it's in the prostate or elsewhere, maybe systemic in the body?
I think just about everybody is going to have some level. And again, we talked about how there's like healthy amounts. And, if we were not getting stimulated to, our immune system wasn't getting stimulated at all, and that wouldn't be a great thing. But I think there's periods where things can become problematic and then not so problematic. And it could be related to cycles that individuals have. It could be seasonal cycles, right? Sometimes people, like in the wintertime, they have cycles where they'll get sick more often. They'll maybe be more depressed because they're not getting as much light. So those types of situations, I think, may lend themselves where they could get more parasites. Eating habits, if you're eating sushi a lot. That's why I say like a parasite cleanse once a year could make a lot of sense, because it's likely there's something there. So it's this maintenance protocol, like the nasal spray, like even a healthy individual, like I said, I keep my glutastat spray in my car, and when I'm driving, I just do a couple sprays. And the way I like to do it, when I spray it, it gets my nose really running. I don't know about you, but like I spray and then I blow my nose. Now I'm like really clear. Then I spray another spray in there, and then it's just kind of like, because you kind of get biofilm out with that first spray.
And for people who are mouth breathers, that can be a simple way without needing some kind of fancy protocol. Start there. If that works, so great. If it doesn't, then you can go down and explore the alternative routes. And actually, I plan on talking to you about functional cranial release today. We didn't get into that at all, or some of the other modalities you're using. So perhaps there'll be a teaser for next time. If people want to connect with you to try your products, I know you have a private members association that I'm a part of called mitozen.club. How would you recommend people get a hold of you, follow your work, or try some of your products?
Yeah, so the clinic website is advancedrejuvenation.us. I'm Dr. John Lieurance at in Instagram. That's my handle. Mitozen, MITOZEN. Like you said, it's a PMA. It's a club. We have a .com site as well, but there's not all the products. Like, so if you're listening to this podcast and some of like the nasal sprays and so forth, we don't have available. Only to club members. So yeah, that's it. I'm on Instagram quite a bit. I'm curious, Nick, where are you? Because you look like you're somewhere tropical.
Yeah, I'm currently on vacation down in Baja, Mexico right now. I usually am based out of Austin, but today is the exception.
Wow. What's this way? Like I'm
here,
wanting you to like move your camera over. Like, is that the beach or something?
No, the beach is down the road. It's like
Okay.
a 30-second walk from here, but that's just the backyard.
That's awesome. Well, enjoy your vacation. How much longer are you there for?
Thanks. I'm here for another 10 days.
Oh, gosh, soak it up, brother.
Yes, will do. Well, Dr. John, this has been a blast like last time, and like hopefully next time will be. If you come back on, we can discuss some of the other things that you're working on and your work that you release.
That sounds great. Yeah, appreciate it. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. Until next time.
I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you enjoyed it, subscribe and hit the thumbs up. I love knowing who's in the 1% committed to reaching their full potential. Comment 1% below so that I know who you are. For all the resources and links, meet me on my website at mindbodypeak.com. I appreciate you and look forward to connecting with you. As a reminder, the information depicted in this video is for information purposes only. Please consult your primary healthcare professional before making any lifestyle changes.